So if I could invite you to kick off. Nerissa Scott.
So I was meant to give a similar talk in Brisbane in March as part of International Women's Day, organised by the powerhouse that is Anna McCormack. But Queensland floods meant I didn't present that weekend, so I volunteered to talk tonight. As Janet said, I'm Nerissa, and I'm a spokeswoman for Save Women's Sports Australasia. You may have heard of us. We're a non-partisan grassroots group, which is part of an international coalition of women's organisations, athletes and supporters of women in sport who assert that male athletes should not compete in female sport. We are all volunteers and we get no funding, contrary to what some of our detractors would have you believe. We think that while everyone has the right to play sport, no one has the right to play in any category they choose. Unfortunately, in the past year, we've seen a rise in mediocre male entitlement encroaching on women's sport. Science denialism coupled with trans activism is having a devastating impact. Like many of the women speaking out on these issues, I assume, I would rather not be. I would rather I didn't have to. I would much rather be putting my energy and time into other pursuits, playing with my baby daughter, relaxing at the beach, or honestly stabbing a blunt object in my eye. That's not only for the anxiety many of us feel public speaking, one of the #1 fears held among the population, and in my case, that's despite a background in radio journalism and broadcasting, but it's also the anxiety of the potential unwanted attention we might attract from activists who disagree with the facts we speak about. Attention that we know can turn to harassment, doxing, being cancelled, threats, and even physical violence. And heartbreakingly, we've had to witness this in real time very recently in relation to the courageous Karyn Lisignoli, co-founder of Save Women's Sport Australasia. For standing up for women's sex-based rights, Karyn has received death threats and fears for her safety and the safety of her family. Her young daughters and partner have moved out of their family home in Sydney due to these very real risks, and the AFP is investigating. And that's not to mention the grotesque witch hunt playing out with the likes of several so-called journalists, with the majority of the mainstream media totally captured and basically working as a propaganda machine. The taxpayer-funded ABC is now akin to the Ministry of Truth. Article 4 of the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights is about reaffirming women's rights to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression. It says states should ensure that women have the right to hold opinions without interference. This should include the right to hold and express opinions about gender identity without being subject to harassment, prosecution, or punishment. It's been a very stressful and confronting time for many of us watching how Karyn Lisignoli is being treated. The misogyny we're witnessing and being subjected to today is off the charts. The other reason I prefer not to speak tonight is simply because it seems so wildly insane that we have to speak at all, when all we're doing is acknowledging and asserting reality and biology, our lived experience. However, here we are. Courage calls to courage everywhere. I'm just a mum, a wife, a woman, and I refuse to stay silent when not only my rights are being destroyed, but also the rights of my daughter. And of course, when I say woman, you know that I mean an adult human female, not an identity, not a label, not a costume, not an idea in a man's head. This erosion and dismantling of rights due to the ideological capture of institutions, academia and governments has been happening under stealth. And we're seeing it in legislation, not just here in Australia, but across the West, with gender identity, which is at direct odds with women's sex-based rights, being enshrined in law. When it comes to sport, we know it is utterly meaningless without fair competition, which is why we have separate categories for disabled people, for children, and for women. However, a desire to be inclusive is having serious negative consequences for women and girls who are losing fair and meaningful competition at all levels of female sport. I know I'm preaching to the converted, but just in case, why the need for the female-only sport category? There are well-known structural differences between males and females. Males typically have proportionately more muscle mass, more bone mass, and a lower percentage of body fat than women. What is less commonly recognised is that there are structural differences between adult males and females for many, if not all, organ systems that can have significant impact on physiological function. For example, sex differences in lung size have important consequences. Men have larger lungs, wider airways, and greater lung diffusion capacity than women. An important consequence of this structural difference is that in contrast to healthy young men, maximal exercise capacity may be limited by pulmonary or lung capacity in women, especially as they age. Researchers also recently discovered 6,500 genes that differ between the sexes. These genetic differences lead to very visible physical differences. The male skeleton is 9% larger, the male skull is larger. There are thousands of observable differences in the male and female body. And seeing as male competitive advantage cannot be completely mitigated by testosterone suppression, a level playing field can never be achieved. Not to mention multiple other reasons aside from safety and fairness. For example, some women's religious beliefs forbid them from being in a state of undress around males or seeing males in a state of undress. Many women wouldn't be comfortable in this same scenario anyway. Privacy, dignity, the unwanted male gaze. And there's studies which show the many benefits of sport participation for females in relation to confidence and self-esteem, all of which would be lost if females self-exclude due to the presence of men in their sports. Yet, we're told that it's unproblematic and, importantly, kind to allow men who adopt a feminine identity into the female category, when in fact all men can and should compete in the men's category, and the women's category should remain restricted to females only, as it was designed. Change the men's category to an open category and the problem is solved. Or as Dawn Fraser perhaps innocently pointed out last week, I don't think it's fair to have transgender men competing against women. Why don't transgender people compete against each other? That would solve all the problems. Article 7 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is about reaffirming women's rights to the same opportunities as men to participate actively in sports and physical education. This is already protected under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, an international treaty to which both Australia and New Zealand are signatories. This should include the provision of opportunities for girls and women to participate in sports and physical education on a single-sex basis. To ensure fairness and safety for women and girls, the entry of boys and men who claim to have female gender identities into teams, competitions, facilities, or changing rooms inter alia set aside for women and girls should be prohibited as a form of sex discrimination. At the Tokyo Games last year, we had to watch and collectively cringe as New Zealand's 43-year-old Laurel, aka Gavin Hubbard, appeared in women's weightlifting. What an absolute farce and an insult to women the world over. Here we had a middle-aged, mediocre, balding, wealthy, well-connected man. His father is a former Auckland mayor and billionaire businessman on the world stage being called she and her. Journalists at the Games were given a thick handbook on how to report on this correctly and what language to use so as not to offend. But what about the offence caused to women and girls? What about the young girls watching at home? Watching what was clearly a man taking the place of a female athlete and it being applauded as stunning and brave. Various media outlets reported it as Hubbard making history, the first openly transgender athlete to compete in a different gender category to their sex assigned at birth, and similar gender woo-woo crap. Richard Budgett, the medical and scientific director for the International Olympic Committee, even said, Laurel Hubbard is a woman and is competing under the rules of her federation. We have to pay tribute to her courage and tenacity in qualifying for the Games. The fact Hubbard wasn't even competitive on the day, or that he perhaps threw the competition, as some suspect, is irrelevant. He is a has-been, past his athletic prime and returning from an injury. What is relevant is a female athlete was denied her opportunity to participate and compete at this level because unfair, outrageous rules give males admission to the women's category. To add insult to injury, in January, the IOC released updated guidance which state there is no need for trans women to lower their testosterone at all to compete in the women's category. You couldn't make this stuff up. This new framework totally ignores the science on sex, gender, and performance and instead focuses on inclusion. It's come under fire from medical experts from multiple sports federations, including World Athletics, World Triathlon, and the International Cycling Union, who say it opens the door to unfair competition in female sport. Then this year, we've had to endure Leah, aka Will Thomas, smashing and setting new women's college swimming records in the States. The 22-year-old competed on the men's team as recently as November 2019. Not to mention reports his female teammates are uncomfortable being made to share facilities with a man, a fully intact male who enjoys walking around semi-nude in the female change rooms. This is assault. This is indecent exposure. This is the insanity of the gender wars. Just like the scandal at the Korean women's spa in LA, when a registered sex offender exposed his genitals to women and children. That transgender male was later charged with indecent exposure. But we are told to suck it up, just be kind, don't be transphobic. The positive is this: these issues are no longer in the dark. A spotlight has been shone on them here in Australia especially. Immense thanks must go to Save Women's Sport Australasia's co-founder, Karyn Lisignoli. Karyn has peaked millions. Kath has stepped away from this campaign to focus on her candidacy in the upcoming federal election, but due to her standing and the media scrutiny she's been subjected to in the process, this collision of rights and many of the associated wrongs being done to women as a sex class are front and centre, despite ongoing attempts to silence and cancel women like Karyn. Karyn is confident she can win her seat in Warringah. She's not giving up. Whatever your political persuasion, you would have to agree that to have a radfem voice in Canberra, the calibre of Karyn, would be a very positive step for Australian women and girls and others negatively impacted by gender identity theory. Kath appreciates the support she's receiving from all sides in standing up for our rights and the rights of her daughters and ours, and we will be forever grateful for her courage. Though it has come at immense personal cost, she is a hero and a warrior and should inspire us all to be brave. Our silence will not save us. A bit of background: one of the reasons we're in this mess is because of new guidelines for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse people in sport, introduced by the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2019. These policies, developed by Australia's leading sport governing body, Sport Australia, working with a lobby group that receives millions of dollars in government funding, Pride in Sport, prioritise the feelings of an apparently small minority at the expense of 50% of the population. Yet on the Sport Australia website, it has the audacity to say, "We recognise that people cannot enjoy themselves or perform at their best if they are treated unfairly." Then in October 2020, Senator Claire Chandler, introduced Karyn to Rowena Edge of Save Women's Sports New Zealand. Kath had raised concerns with Senator Chandler about the new guidelines that displace sex as the category for sport competition in favour of self-declared gender identity. Seeing as Australia and New Zealand were both facing the same issues, Save Women's Sport Australasia was formed and joined a movement to protect the integrity of women's sport. We are part of the resistance, a growing global resistance to this insidious ideology which positions the special feelings of men and boys above the lived reality of girls and women. Unsurprising to many, Karyn Lisignoli helped Senator Claire Chandler in drafting the Save Women's Sport Bill, which Senator Chandler introduced into Parliament recently. This bill seeks to ensure that women's single-sex sport is protected and encouraged, and that a male is not entitled to demand that they be included on the basis of gender identity. Save Women's Sport has received hundreds of emails from sportswomen, girls and their parents, coaches and others who can see the issues created by prioritising this intangible gender identity over biological sex, the unfairness due to male athletic advantage and the fear of speaking out and being labelled a bigot or transphobe. I know I don't only speak for myself when I say we don't care if they call us transphobic. It has no meaning. When it comes to sport, this is simply about fairness. Activists play the transphobia card to silence and intimidate, to deter us from speaking out. We're told trans women are women and are expected to accept that fallacy, no debate. But we know for a fact that trans women are men. We recognise this reality and refuse to have our language altered to accommodate this ideological takeover. We refuse to pretend men are women, to pretend that men don't have physiological and biological advantages due to being male. We refuse to subscribe to this lie that effectively erases women as a sex class. Mediocre males invading women's spaces and sports, disregarding women's boundaries, forcing their way in and demanding girls and women go along with the absolute bollocks that these entitled males are in fact women. A female's experience of her biological sex is in no way the same as a man who identifies as a woman, whatever that means. Something we can all do is contact our federal MPs and senators, write letters, meet with them, raise your concerns, educate them. Head to savewomensport.com, join the mailing list, donate to the cause if you can, and join the resistance. We 100% support the Respect My Sex If You Want My Vote campaign and applaud the women who've made that happen here in Australia. With a few weeks until the federal election, we all need to do whatever we can to make more noise and to capitalise on the current media attention and peaking that's happening. We obviously need to do so safely, as unfortunately the risks are very real. Adult human females have rights based on our sex, and they are under attack. Most of the population do not subscribe to this ideology and certainly don't want it in our sports, because bodies play sport, not identities. For the sake of women's sport, it must be preserved for female bodies, for women only.